So if you hadn't picked up on it, today's Palm Sunday. Today we celebrate the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. We do this every year because it is a big deal. It is a big deal that Jesus rode into Jerusalem at the beginning of what we call Holy Week, at the beginning of the Passover. This was the final Passover that Jesus would celebrate as a human. And we celebrate it every year. Not only do we celebrate it every year, but it is one of those rare, wonderful events that is told about in all four of the Gospels. Outside of the events of Holy Week, there's only like 2 or 3 instances where something that Jesus did is told in all 4 of the Gospels. That in and of itself tells us this is a big deal. It is a big deal that Jesus rode into Jerusalem. Now, the details about how Jesus came into Jerusalem vary a little bit, depending on which gospel you read. Sometimes he's riding a colt, the foal of a donkey. Sometimes he's on a donkey. Sometimes he's on both, as Larry Carrington told us in Sunday school class, just like a trick rider at the rodeo. But regardless, he's riding in, and that's a big deal. I mean, can you think of another example in the Gospels where Jesus rides anything? No. Wherever he was going, he was walking. And yet now, he rides in. And there's a parade, even an impromptu parade. That tells us that he has done or is someone special. He rides in like a royal dignitary or a state football champ. He comes in with all the honor that is bestowed upon a special person that is visiting. But he doesn't come in as a conquering hero. No, if he had done that, he'd have been on a horse. Because horses were instruments of war. No, he is riding on a donkey and on the foal, the colt, the foal of a donkey. So Jesus comes in, and all 4 of the Gospels agree that when he comes in, people shout. And they praise him, and they wave something. This year in Matthew, you'll notice we didn't have palm branches, did we? We just had branches that were cut from trees that were laid down in this path. But still, it was something important. And you have to remember when the Gospel writers are telling the story of Jesus, they all have different points of view. They all see different things in his story that they want to infer or make a specific point about. But that's what's so amazing about the triumphal entry. They all agreed this is a big deal. All the people yelled that this is the blessed King who is to come to save them. That is something upon which all of the Gospels agree, even if the details of how he came in vary. So it is important for us to celebrate each and every year this triumphal entry where Jesus the King who has come is come to save us. Now, this year in Matthew, at the end of the parade, he goes directly into the temple. And when he gets there, we are told that he drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. Now, this is another event that happens in all 4 of the Gospels. In all 4 of the Gospels, there is this event in the temple where Jesus drives people out. But all 4 of them tell it pretty differently. The why and the when and the how is all kind of up in the air. For example, in Matthew, it goes straight from parade to temple, and Jesus is driving people out. But in Mark, it happens the day after Jesus comes into Jerusalem. In Luke, Jesus takes a little bit of a side trip and does some weeping for Jerusalem before he goes to the temple. And in John, Jesus goes to the temple and drives everyone out 3 years before the big parade that gets Jesus into the temple. So remember, each of the gospel writers are trying to tell us something. And because they tell the same story in 4 very different ways, it suggests to me that they too are trying to figure out what this means. This bit about Jesus cleansing the temple, as we like to call it. But it's odd that that we call it the cleansing of the temple. I mean, that's the subtitle we get in all of our Gospels, right? If you're reading along and you have one of those Bibles, that section stands off, it says, Jesus cleanses the temple. Or maybe you've seen a painting representing Jesus cleansing the temple. But nowhere in any of the four Gospels do the writers themselves say that Jesus cleansed the temple. You see, in Jesus' day, if something were to be cleansed, that referred most likely to the Jewish concept of purity, of being clean. See, in Jewish society at the time, one needed to be clean in order to be righteous. You had to be clean and to be righteous, ritually clean, so you could enter the temple. So if they said that Jesus cleansed the temple, that would suggest that the temple was not a righteous place. So that's not what Matthew says. So rather than saying cleansing, maybe we should say disturbing. Jesus disturbed what was happening in the temple that day. Now, some of you may be familiar with the layout of the second temple, right? I'm sure you have the schematics on the walls of your house. Yes, one does. Thank you, Katie. Someone has paid attention. So nice. Now she's denying it. Anyway, so the temple was in sections, and the outer section was known as the court of the Gentiles. And in the court of the Gentiles, anyone could walk about and meander. And chances are, the people who Jesus drove out, that's where they were, in that court of the Gentiles. Now, some people suggest that the reason Jesus drove them out of the temple that day was because he was protesting a corrupt commercial system that was taking advantage of the pilgrims who had traveled to Jerusalem. Maybe. But I don't think that's here in Matthew. I mean, you have to remember this was Passover, right? So at Passover, pilgrims from all over have come to celebrate in Jerusalem. The population of the city has almost tripled during this week. And in this court of Gentiles, where all of these people were selling these wares, they were serving a very practical purpose. Now imagine you're a pilgrim who lives 75 miles away from Jerusalem, right? No cars, you gotta walk, and you're supposed to sacrifice an ox at the temple. Would it be easier to tow that ox 75 miles, or to sell the ox, get the money, go to the temple and buy another ox and sacrifice it there on the side? It would be easier that way, right? So they served a practical purpose. And also, any money that you gave to the temple, it couldn't be Roman money. Because Roman coins had faces on them, had idols on them. You had to change that Roman money into currency that could be given to the temple. So the people who sold the sacrifices and the money changers, they were serving a practical purpose. Now, often we point to that phrase where Jesus says that thing about the den of robbers, right? And we make that to mean that Jesus was talking about the people who were selling or actually robbing the people. But that's not what that means. That den of robbers quote comes from Zechariah. Zechariah is a prophet. No, wait, it comes from Jeremiah. Excuse me. One of those eyes. It comes from Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a prophet. And Jeremiah was protesting the way that the people were abusing their religion. He was criticizing those who would go out and live whatever life they wanted to live, and then they would come into the sanctity of the temple and declare that all was good in their lives, that they were right with God. So regardless of how they lived, they came to the temple, they felt like they were right with God. And Jeremiah was decrying them as being hypocrites of their own religion. So Jesus is talking about people who practice false religion, false piety. And so I think that the point that Matthew is trying to get across to us about why Jesus drove all those who were selling and buying in the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. I think the reason Jesus disturbed those vendors because he was trying to get their attention about some false religion that was happening at that time. So the question now is, when he got their attention, did he do it for symbolic or for logistical reasons? Okay? Now we know that Jesus was a rabbi, right? A teacher. One of you knows that? Yeah. Jesus was a rabbi, a teacher. He had disciples that followed him around, that he taught all the time. If you look through the Gospels, it is rife with parables, with stories, with teachings, with miracles that were there to teach the disciples something. And we also see in the Gospels that the disciples are not very good at learning something. Now, it was common for rabbis to do symbolic actions as a sign of teaching, especially at Passover. There's a story, I think it comes from Josephus, where a rabbi drove a herd of sheep into the temple to prove a point. I have no idea what that point was, but still, that's what Jesus may have been doing. Because it was a custom of rabbis to try to make a point in that symbolic way. And we know too that Jesus was a prophet, right? And it was pretty common for prophets in the Hebrew tradition to use instances from their lives to really put a pronounced statement on their teachings. Sometimes even through whom they married. Sometimes by smashing clay pots. Sometimes by creating contracts for the futures. Prophets were known to symbolic acts. So it could be that this driving out of the people who did those things in the temple was a symbolic act of Jesus. But it could also be a very practical act. Remember, the population of Jerusalem at this time tripled in size. Court of the Gentiles, everyone's there. People are probably jam-packed shoulder to shoulder. Now, I don't know if y'all have ever been in a situation like that, but it's pretty miserable. When I was 18, I went to my first Mardi Gras in New Orleans. And I made a huge mistake and went to Bourbon Street. The reason it's a huge mistake to go to Bourbon Street during Mardi Gras is because everybody goes to Bourbon Street during Mardi Gras. And you are in there shoulder to shoulder. And you don't get to decide where you go. The crowd tells you where you're going to go. And we had a group of people and we were worried about getting separated, so we all kind of joined hands, single file. We had the biggest guy in the front, the biggest guy in the back. We looked like first graders on a field trip to a museum. And still we got separated. I mean, there's some people we lost that night. I hadn't even found them on Facebook since then. It is not a pleasant experience to be that jam-packed together. Imagine that in the court of the Gentiles. Now, it is doubtful that Jesus drove all of those people out. But he definitely drove some of them out. He drove out enough to make room for himself. Because what did he do next? As soon as he drove them out, he went on with his ministry. He healed the lame and the blind. And if you're going to heal the lame and the blind in that big of a space, you better make some space for them to come to, right? So it could be that Jesus was doing all this for a symbolic reason, trying to prove a point about people who practice false piety, or it could be that he was doing it for practical reasons, to make space for himself to heal in his ministry. My hunch is that, at least from Matthew's point of view, Jesus' disturbing the temple is making a solid point, both symbolic and practical. He is giving a warning to those who practice false religion. Now let's be clear, Jesus isn't saying that Judaism is a false religion. I mean, Jesus and all of his disciples were Jewish. But he was warning those who practiced it falsely. Remember, there are lots of religious leaders in the city at this time who would rather give deference to Caesar than to God. That's who Jesus is preaching against. There are a lot of people in the city at this time during Passover who relied on their wealth and their status. They look down above those who are lowly and forget that they are there. That's who Jesus is talking about. There are lots of people in the city at this time who look to Rome for power and not to that which is eternal for power. That is who Jesus is talking to. Jesus is telling them, you need to make way for what is real. You need to make way for what I am about. You need to make way for that which is mercy, compassion, and love. That is the big deal that we celebrate with Palm Sunday. Jesus making way for living out the gospel of mercy, compassion, and love. And he does it in the way that tells the powerful who have gained their power on the backs of the powerless. You need to make way. And it's important to remember this as we approach Holy Week, as we approach the cross. Because it is those people in power to whom Jesus said, you need to make way for the powerless. It was those people who heard that message that hung him on the cross.